This is a meeting of HEAL. I usually like to say at the beginning, welcome to another evening of dangerous information. That's a phrase that was coined to describe the facts that we share with people by AIDS Project Los Angeles. They said that our information was dangerous. So the question that to ask after that is to whom? But HEAL, this is an organization that actually began in the early 80s in New York City. It started out as an AIDS support group. Then it evolved into a group that was bringing macrobiotic meals to homebound. Great microphone stand. And after a PhD in mathematics got into the leadership of it, it became a group that started questioning the whole epidemiology of AIDS and all the inconsistencies and anomalies of the HIV causes AIDS hypothesis. In 1995, after going through a wild personal experience of taking an HIV test because every woman should, according to my gynecologist. I tested sort of positive, then I tested positive, then I tested indeterminate, then I tested negative, then I tested positive again, ad infinitum. And my last test that I took most recently was antibody positive, virus negative. And I had the exact opposite of those two test results in 1993. I was antibody negative and virus positive. So I think I've had every test result a human being could possibly have on every HIV test that exists. And what that told me was something's wrong with the picture. It's not as simple as it seems. HIV equals AIDS. People are being told based on the presence of antibodies, which are good things, that they're going to get diseases. And I started doing a lot of research into this, and the research evolved into starting my own chapter of HEAL here in Los Angeles with the help of lots of great people who are around the room, and most of us have these name tags on, so you can ask us questions if you have any. And what we do, what our object is here, what our objective is to share with you information that is very hard to come by. You really don't find it too often in mainstream literature. Where's our roadie? You don't see it too often on television, you don't hear it too often on the radio, but if you really want to find it, it's there. And unfortunately, most people don't know it's available. And for those of us who are directly affected by all of this, this information can mean the difference between life and death, not just only in a physical sense, but in a spiritual and emotional sense. I think it needs some more. Yeah. What is this? It looks like a satellite. So that's what we do here, is we bring to you and make available to you what was so very hard for me and other people like me to find, which was honest information about all of this. Facts that aren't estimates, numbers that aren't exaggerated, the true story with all the unanswered questions, and everything that makes everybody so nervous about anybody questioning this. I think HIV and AIDS are the only medical conditions that we're not allowed to discuss. We can talk about just about anything, but the minute you question HIV and AIDS, you're considered politically incorrect or a jerk or a troublemaker or something else. And we're not any of those things. We're just people whose lives have been affected by this in one way or another, who want to make this information available to other people. And that's the purpose of this group. We meet once a month here in Plummer Park. Each month we bring a variety of interesting speakers from all over the place, and it's just through serendipity that we get them here, because we don't take any money from the drug companies or the government, which is where most AIDS organizations get their money from. The other source is celebrities. But and so we run on the goodwill of the volunteers, so lots of hard work. And when you purchase anything back there from our literature table, we brought together a collection of literature from all over the place on various topics related to all of this. When you spend any kind of money back there, it all goes back into producing these events and making more literature available to people everywhere. Since 1995, when I started to HEAL here, there were 3 chapters in the United States. Now we have 23. We had 4 open just since the beginning of this year. So it's something that's really growing. And we have lots of great stuff back there. I want to give a special emphasis to the 2-hour documentary, HIV equals AIDS, Fact or Fraud, that we've run out of a couple of times. It's back there tonight and available. And that will be premiering as a film at the Limley Theater on Sunset in June. We've got together a deal with the Limley Theaters, and they're also going to give it a run there, which is really great because a lot of people will be able to get a hold of that information that way. Other things that are going on with HEAL, and all these things make me so tired. We have our first fundraising event coming up in May, fundraiser at an art gallery. We have 50 artists so far that have donated their works to this, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun and a really great evening. We've also got a playwright that's going to be coming out here from Colorado. He's written and produced an award-winning play called Dr. Antonioni's Imaginary Illness, which is a satire on HIV, AIDS, and Western medicine all together, and it's supposed to be a really great show, and we're trying to bring that out here in July. Next month we have, you'll find this on your chair, boy, this is real dangerous information, this one. We have Dr. David Rasnick, who's a designer of protease inhibitors. This thing is stupid. Who's coming out to talk with us. There was just recently, last week, a conference in Ventura called the Gordon Conference, Chemotherapy and AIDS Treatment. It was really interesting because what they were discussing was AZT, DDI, 3TC, D4T, all the things that they tell us are antivirals. It was a conference for only scientists, no public and no press. So I guess they didn't have to worry too much about what they called it, so they called it what it was, a conference on chemotherapy and AIDS treatment. And Dr. Rasnick is going to be giving us a report on what went on there, and it'll be interesting to know what goes on when they think nobody's going to find out about what goes on. So that's next month, April 23rd, right here in Plummer Park. Also, by popular demand, we're having a support kind of a group, but it's not a support group. It's a group where you can come and talk about these ideas, where you can question this whole thing, where you can learn, where you can share information and experiences. And this is going to be mediated by Kim Freitas, who's HEAL's crisis intervention counselor. And it's going to take place on Monday evenings. And anybody who's just getting into this or has been into this for a long time, who wants to share with other people, possibly meet some, like-minded souls, and get together and talk. That's going to be on Monday nights. We also have a new information pack on protease inhibitors. It's the usual size, about 40 or so pages on things that are really hard to find in mainstream media on protease inhibitors. So that's back there too on our literature table tonight for the first time. Also, I wanted to let you know that there's going to be on a Turner Broadcast System, listed as WTBS or TBS in your television guide, a segment about moi, yours truly, and HEAL, screening on Sunday, April 30th, that's Easter Sunday, March 30th, 7 o'clock p.m., thank you. And also it's going to screen again on May 7th on CNN. When it screens March 30th on TBS, the program is called Topics. And when it screens on May 7th at 7 p.m. on CNN, the program is called America's Edge. But what they did is they came out to interview me and a couple other people. The two other people had tested positive, went on the recommended medicines, later tested negative, and now suffer irreparable damage from the medicines they took, both physically and psychically, emotionally. So it's pretty interesting. They wanted to contrast these people who are just like devastated, broken, sad, and destroyed with somebody who got a positive test result and went on with life and did something else besides follow the orders and then fall apart. So that'll be on television. I'm looking forward to that because it'll be the first time I think that what we do gets any kind of attention on national television, so that'll be nice. Other than that, I don't really have too much to say for once in my life. So I think we'll just get our speaker up here. John Lauritsen has been chronicling the history of AIDS since the very beginning of everything. He's been a writer, a reporter for the New York Native magazine. He published a series of books. I believe his first book was AZT, Poison by Prescription. He was one of the first and only journalists to ever analyze the data from the original AZT trials and find out that the information that was the basis for the approval of these drugs was very fraudulent, laden with all kinds of problems and dishonest manipulation of numbers and facts. His next book is a compilation of many of his works throughout the year called The AIDS War. We have that back there also. And the last one he wrote most recently is The AIDS Cult, is that correct? Which are different essays about the whole phenomenon of AIDS as a social, political thing that's going on in our society. One person, most recently in an article that's actually in here, said that AIDS isn't a disease, it's a social phenomenon. And I think that comes pretty close to describing what's going on. Anyway, I'd like to welcome John Lauritsen, who's here from the East Coast in a very rare appearance, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. Please, if you have questions, it would be great if you could save them to the end. We welcome all questions, especially if they're in the form of questions and not speeches. So if you have questions, please hold them until the end. There'll be ample time for everyone to ask their questions, but we'd appreciate it if they could wait until the end. So without further delay, Mr. John Lauritsen.
How does this mic work? If I speak like this, do you hear me in the back?
No.
No? Should I? Okay.
You can pick that up if you want.
We can crank it up. Yeah, crank it up. Yeah, crank it up a foot.
Okay, if I talk. Is this better if I talk this way? Is that too loud or?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I've been fighting laryngitis off and on, so I'm trying to save my voice. In the past, I sometimes tried to cover everything. I once tried to cover everything in 30 minutes from an eagle's eye view. And it was a challenge to do it, but I'm definitely not going to do that tonight. I'm just going to talk and cover a few basic points. The title I had tentatively thought of would be called Surviving Terror and Disinformation, which is where it gets down to. I've increasingly moving to see how really important the psychological elements are in making people sick in ways that are called AIDS. I was trying to think of my favorite quotes of those who are AIDS critics, and I think still my favorite one was by an East German. I'll give you the English translation. He said, "The virus doesn't kill, the diagnosis does." Okay. So, there are some AIDS activists or treatment activists, so-called, who try to keep up with everything. AIDS is enormously complicated. There are well over 100,000 papers written on the topic, and it's a full-time thing to try to keep up with all of it, all of the technobabble that you have to learn. I think treatment activists can be divided into two camps: those who are phonies, which is probably most of them, and the information that they get would come right from the pharmaceutical companies, and all they have to do is spout it. But there are some of them that are honest, and they drive themselves crazy trying to keep up with the latest test. Is the P24 antigen test valid this week or isn't it? And if it is valid, what is it valid for? And so on and so forth. I think that one of the reasons why we have this incredible technobabble, all of this biotechnological jargon, is because of the hypothesis that a retrovirus caused these illnesses. Well, it's a crazy hypothesis, and furthermore, there was never any evidence for it. Carrie Mullis, who you know, the Nobel Prize winner who invented the polymerase chain reaction test, was asked what the most powerful argument was against the HIV/AIDS hypothesis. And he said, that's easy, the fact that there's no evidence for it. If there had been a different hypothesis, if, for example, there had been a hypothesis that people sick in ways that are called AIDS were sick because they were possessed by evil spirits, we might have an extremely different vocabulary. It would be that of theology, and the experts, instead of being doctors and molecular biologists, would be priests. They would be walking around with amulets and charms and maybe garlic, and there would be chants. You would hear chants. There would be incense. language would be things like ego te exorcizo in nomine blah blah blah. And on the whole, this might be a great deal healthier than what's happening. And I would maintain seriously that the evil spirit hypothesis fits the facts much better than the HIV hypothesis does. However, I'm a secular humanist, and so I shouldn't get bogged down in that kind of thing. Some of the essays in my new book, there are 8 different contributors, try to go in, to move beyond simply questioning of what causes the AIDS illnesses, and understand the cultural and psychological issues involved. Casper Schmidt, who has the first essay, goes into concepts of mass hysteria, and he said that basically we are in a trance state. That's something he said many times to me when I knew him, and we are. And I think now with the euphoria over the protease inhibitors, in some ways the trance state is stronger than ever. What I'm going to try to do is just take a few issues and try to pierce through the trance state, to try to get us back to reality. I'll go into the definition of AIDS, and I maintain that there really is no such thing as AIDS. There's no coherent disease entity that ever has been or ever could be defined rationally. Secondly, that HIV, which may not even exist, doesn't cause illness. And third, that the treatments that have been given to this phony illness have been deadly and are killing people, have killed many tens or even perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. And then finally, just a suggestion of what should we do. To go back to the very first definitions of AIDS, back in '84, in so many words, you had AIDS if you had a condition of so-called immune deficiency, but none of the usual causes of immune deficiency were there. Now, all kinds of things can cause immune deficiency, and immune deficiency is not a new concept. You could look in the Merck manual from, say, the 40s, 50s. Actually, I'm not sure. You could look in the Merck manual at least many years before AIDS, and you would find types of immune deficiency described. Well, this is sort of crazy to say that if you have immune deficiency but none of the usual causes, then whatever's left over has to be something the world has never seen before, and something which they all thought was caused by a new, exotic, deadly microbe. Well, that's nonsense, and it's even more nonsense because the first cases certainly did have known causes of immune deficiency. Virtually all of them were heavy substance abusers. Then the definition of AIDS changed many times, basically by adding more and more so-called AIDS indicator diseases. In 1988, AIDS peaked. The incidence of AIDS would have started going down, except that the CDC added a whole lot of new AIDS indicator diseases, which caused the incidence briefly for a while to go up. Right now we have a total of approximately 30 AIDS indicator diseases. And the formula here, Peter Duesberg is the first one to formulate it, is that if you have one or more of the AIDS indicator diseases, plus HIV, which can be simply presumed, then you have a diagnosis of AIDS. But if you have one of the AIDS indicator diseases, all of which are old, but you don't have HIV, either, according to whatever indication, then the indicator disease is just called by its old name. So tuberculosis with an HIV negative result is tuberculosis. If the result is positive, then it's called AIDS. In New York City, the intravenous drug users are getting sick in exactly the same ways they were getting sick 50 years ago, which is to say they suffer emaciation and one or another type of lung disease. That's absolutely the classic profile of a long-term heroin user. A woman of the New York City Health Department had to admit that whether or not they give an AIDS diagnosis depends on the antibody test. If it's positive, they call it AIDS, but if it's negative, they just say that's, typical junkie with lung disease and emaciation, and yet there's not the slightest difference in the clinical profiles. The definition is even more absurd because the AIDS indicator diseases have absolutely nothing in common. Some are caused by bacteria, some by viruses, some by funguses. Some don't have any known cause at all. Some of them are related to immune deficiency and some of them aren't. And in fact, if we go back to 1984 once more, basically there were two AIDS indicator diseases then, Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. These two diseases had nothing in common. It's not true to say that they were both caused by so-called immune deficiency. Kaposi sarcoma is not caused by immune deficiency. In fact, everything that was believed about it then is now known to be false. Sarcoma is a Latin word which means cancer, and they all thought that KS was a cancer. I was at a meeting in Washington a few years ago sponsored by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Robert Gallo and top people in the public health service were there, and they gave the latest thinking on Kaposi sarcoma. The meeting was to discuss the relationship between paupers and KS. It is now known that KS is definitely not a cancer. It's an abnormality of the blood vessels, but in no way a cancer, which means that the treatments that were given in the early days were all inappropriate. They were all forms of chemotherapy designed to kill cancer. Secondly, KS is not caused by immune deficiency. In fact, sometimes they believe that the immune systems of people with KS are overly active. Third, KS is not caused by HIV. This is something they all admit. Gallo himself admitted it, which makes a very awkward situation when you have the most characteristic of all of the AIDS illnesses, the one in everybody's mind when you think of AIDS is KS, and yet it's not caused by HIV. This makes a very awkward situation for people who have the HIV/AIDS hypothesis. So in a nutshell, I would say that people are sick, but people with AIDS diagnoses are sick in different ways and for different reasons. And it's our task to try to explain them. But in no way is it true that all these things are caused by immune deficiency, which in turn is caused by HIV. Even the concept of immune deficiency is phony. It's based on tests counting T4 cells, which were perfected at exactly the time that the definition of AIDS was constructed, which is a miraculous coincidence, isn't it? It's like a new technique, and instantly, what do we do with it? Oh, here's a disease the world's never seen before. The T4 thing has now become a diagnostic tool, and one of the ways you can get an AIDS diagnosis is to be HIV positive and to have fewer than 200 T cells. The research used to say what this means has never been done. We don't know what the benchmarks are on T4 counts in the general population. We don't know how they correlate with health or sickness. They were used immediately before really anything was known about them. We do know that some people can have virtually none and be in good health, and others can have what seems like a normal count and they get sick and die. The other part of the equation is HIV. Now, if we talk about the cutting edge of AIDS criticism, it gets down to whether or not HIV even exists as an independent infectious virus. And that's a long discussion. Generally, the tests that are given are antibody tests, the ELISA and the Western blot. Christine Johnson has done the most work here in showing that all kinds of things, I think up to 50 or 60 conditions, can cross-react in such a way as to give a positive reading. These tests were used before they were ever properly validated. Now that's a technical term. Before tests are used, the tests themselves are supposed to be tested. And they're tested for various things, how accurate, how reliable, and so on. When a test is validated, this means answering the question, what is it that this test measures? And in the case of the HIV test, we don't know. They were never validated before they were put into use. But all kinds of things. Past history of diseases, a vaccination for the flu, history of alcoholism or drug abuse, all of these can cause the body to form antigens which cross-react with the test in such a way that a positive reading can be given. Well, this is something to think about, because the arguments I've made, and Peter Duisberg and others, is that probably the main reason people get sick in ways that are called AIDS have to do with drugs, which would include both so-called recreational drugs and pharmaceutical drugs. So if drugs can make people sick in ways that qualified for AIDS, which they certainly can, alcohol alone can very much increase one's susceptibility to pneumonia, for example, as well as a lot of other things. Heroin certainly can lead to pneumonia. Not only can these forms of drug abuse cause the AIDS indicator diseases, but they could cause a positive reading on the tests, therefore leading to an AIDS diagnosis. And once it's treated, eventually a decline into further illness and death is almost inevitable. I want to try to just simplify things as much as possible to give you one single way of saying that HIV is not the cause of AIDS. Some of the arguments which have been used have been things like Koch's first postulate, which briefly says if a germ really causes a particular disease, then every time you have the disease, you ought to be able to find the germ. And there should be a lot of it. It shouldn't be difficult to find it at all. Peter Duisberg has used the concept of biochemical activity, saying that if a germ is causing illness, it's highly active biochemically. That's another thing. I'm going to try to take a slightly different handle of saying really the same thing. Let's focus on the words HIV infection. Now, the assumption that's always made is that if somebody is positive on the so-called antibody tests, that this means they have an infection. This is turning everything on its head, because normally antibodies protect, and if it were hepatitis, and you had a lot of hepatitis antibodies but no virus, they would say, oh, that's good news. This means you have lifetime immunity against hepatitis. But what does it mean to say HIV infection? People talk about someone having HIV, or they'll say HIV infected. And there are techniques like the polymerase chain reaction test, which can, in effect, find a needle in a haystack. It could detect a genetic sequence believed to be associated with HIV in 1 out of 1,000,000 cells. That might apply to a word infected, but when we say infection, the ordinary meaning is quite different. When we talk about an infection, we mean not only that a germ is present in extremely large quantities, but that there are types of symptoms that are associated with the presence of the germ in very large quantities. I looked up, the American Heritage Dictionary actually had the best definitions here, and it's absolutely clear that in the ordinary usage of infection, there has to be a great deal of the microbe present, and also there have to be consequences. There should also be a correlation. So if there's viremia, which would be a term essentially meaning that the blood would be literally flooded with the virus, it would mean that every single milliliter of plasma would have hundreds of thousands to billions of free infectious viruses. You ought to have viremia, which would correlate with people getting sick in ways that were called AIDS. This has never been observed. And conversely, if there's an absence of viremia, there should be an absence of symptoms. If I were to pose the question of people with diagnoses of full-blown AIDS, what proportion of them have HIV infection? It's kind of an unfair thing, but I'll supply the answer myself. I maintain that there is one correct answer here. The percentage of people with AIDS diagnoses who have HIV infection is 0. Nobody has ever demonstrated HIV infection. Nobody has ever demonstrated HIV infection. Part of the controversy on whether HIV exists as an independent virus. And this would mean the whole thing with its protein coding with the little knobs and so on, which we've seen pictures of. Most of you don't realize that these pictures, like the one that was on the front cover of Scientific American, are basically fantasies. They're what HIV ought to look like, and they're what other retroviruses do look like, but it's not a representation of HIV. To isolate a retrovirus using the conventional time-tested way means that you have to purify it. All retroviruses are pretty much the same. They're all about the same weight. Peter Duesberg has said they're sort of like Volkswagens. They might have different colors of paint, but otherwise they're, you know, the Beetle, they're all the same. So what you do is, using a technique, I won't go into the gruesome details, but you separate whatever is in the plasma by weight. Things that are heavier get spun off here, lighter there. Eventually you get a band of whatever there would be at the molecular weight of retroviruses. And if there are any retroviruses there, and if there's an illness caused by them, you'll find them. There'll be a lot of them, hundreds of thousands and millions, you know, per milliliter of plasma. The next thing you'll do is to look at it. And viruses are small, retroviruses are small, but they're not so small that they can't be photographed using the appropriate electron micro whatever thing. You would find a great deal of them. Now, nobody has ever taken a picture of HIV that has been properly purified. There have been pictures of a human cell with a bump on it, or several bumps. So what? They're bumps. There's no way of knowing that those in fact are retroviruses or HIV. There have been other things which were, you know, little particles which might or might not be a retrovirus, but since they weren't properly purified, one doesn't know what it is. If this had ever been done, I suspect this has probably been attempted hundreds or thousands of times, with who knows what, 40 or 50 billion dollars already spent on HIV research, more than on any other German history. It stands to reason they must have tried the absolutely standard technique for isolating retroviruses. So we have to assume in a way what happened when they tried it. They look at a band, which is where retroviruses would be if there were any. Well, there weren't. To me, that's the only thing that makes sense. In other words, there are no, if HIV were doing anything at all, there would have to be free infectious viruses. The whole thing, the plasma would be flooded with them. And for well over a decade, this was what was found, or rather what wasn't found. Finally, the arguments of Duesberg started to have an effect. It's as though the AIDS establishment said, you know, maybe he's right. Maybe if HIV were doing something, there really would have to be a lot of it and a lot of biochemical activity. And it's almost as though they said, hey guys, you know, somebody better go out and do some research to find that it's really active after all. So that's what they did. The Ho and Wei papers reported in Nature tried to show that everybody before them had been wrong, and that in fact there was a very high level of biochemical activity on the part of HIV. On the other hand, you never could find HIV. Why not? So they devised what was then ridiculed as the open sink model. The idea that there was an incredible activity on the part of HIV. Every day, billions of particles were made. But the immune system was also active, so as soon as an HIV virus was produced, the immune system gobbled it up and it disappeared. Like an open sink, no matter how much water went in the sink, it went down the drain right away. Well, okay, it really is ridiculous. And it was so ridiculous that not only critics like Peter Duesberg and Harvey Bialy responded and ridiculed the Ho and Wei thing, but also so did a number of scientists who think that HIV is the cause. A mathematician, Mark Craddock in Australia, analyzed some of the math, and he just threw up his hands in despair and said, when will these people ever get down to reality? But anyway, all of this led into the viral load tests, which is the new thing for the protease inhibitor things. for probably the first time, the efficacy of a drug, which is now being taken by many tens of thousands of people, not a drug, combinations of drugs, they're being judged not by whether or not they help people. The health of the people taking them is almost irrelevant. It's entirely on this one test, the viral load test, which is simply preposterous. The viral load test is based on the polymerase chain reaction test, invented by Kary Mullis, who got the Nobel Prize for doing it. And Kary Mullis said that the idea of quantitative PCR is an oxymoron. This test was never meant to count anything, although when you talk to people going in the cocktails, they all believe that viral load means that's how many viruses there are in their blood. They think it really does count things. It does no such thing. It merely identifies particular genetic sequences which are believed, probably wrongly in many cases, to belong to HIV, and so on and so forth. If I went on, it would get technical, and I'm not the best person to do that. So I would say that the definition of AIDS is phony. The alleged notion of HIV infection is phony because there never is such a thing. Lately, well, not lately, but over the years, I've increasingly come to appreciate the role of psychological factors, and the new book, The AIDS Cult, is by a number of people, 8 contributors. We're all AIDS dissidents. Not a single one of us think that HIV is harmful. But it tries to analyze all of the many forces, everything from why do gay men allow this to happen to them, why, has there been, Casper Schmidt, who has the lead thing, used a phrase which sort of hit home to me. He said that ACT and the similar things are sadistic medicine. And there's a long history of sadistic medicine. I mean, if you looked at treatment, say, for syphilis over the centuries, or other things, the idea was to give a treatment which would punish the person who was sick. And that punishing them was the appropriate way for them to get better. I think to take the psychological issues, I'm a gay man, and I don't think it is possible to understand the AIDS phenomenon without understanding the hatred of gay men in Judeo-Christian culture. And I would make the case that the origin of AIDS really goes back 2,500 years ago to the taboo that was in the Holiness Code of Leviticus, which prescribed the death penalty for 2 men who made love to each other. This was only one particular tradition, but it happens to be that of the culture we live in. At the same time, in all of the rest of the world, certainly in ancient Greece and at the same time, male love occupied a place of honor. And we still, to some extent, are informed by the culture of ancient Greece. Our notions of humanism, philosophy, science, all come from Greece. But in this case, the taboo in Leviticus holds sway. Casper Schmidt, in his lead essay in the book, goes into the campaign of Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, Anita Bryant, the various right-wing bigots, which preceded AIDS by about 5 years. And once you have read that, it is impossible to understand what's happened. You never quite look at things in the same way. Well, that's a very big topic. One could have an entire seminar on the psychological issues in AIDS, and I hope sometime we will. To go into the treatment issues, logically, I've always been impressed by when I studied ancient philosophy, the philosophy of Aristotle. And he makes a very basic point. Science is cumulative. You build on what you know. In any type of logic, you have to start somewhere. Where do you start? Where you start is what's self-evident. You have to start with things that you know absolutely for sure, and then you build on those things. We have to also be willing to go back, and re-examine things. I mean, there may be a mistake there. But at any rate, we have to hold on what we do know. Hello.
I got next. No worries, just take a walk.
Could you close the door? Or? Okay, I have sort of a bulldog tendency in some ways. I like to hold on what I do know, and I'm the person who uncovered fraud in the ACT trials. In 1987, I looked through several hundred of pages of FDA documents that had been obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. And since my profession is survey research, I could tell that not only there was this terrible sloppy research, but that the mortality data couldn't possibly be correct. I knew this as an absolute certainty for a lot of reasons which are hard to explain to people without a statistical background. Some of the documents did describe things that clearly would be cheating, although there were tantalizing gaps in it. Then several years later, I got more documents, which I had to fight for months to get under the Freedom of Information Act. And it clearly indicated the types of cheating that took place in the Boston Center, one of the 12. And it was really very blatant cheating. People had horrible, hideous side effects from the ACT, and yet the investigators indicated they had had no side effects whatever. And of course, this is one of the things the study was designed to look at, was ACT safe? So that and many other things were blatant cheating. The investigators who found the cheating recommended that absolutely none of this data be used, that the entire Boston Center be dropped from the data of the study, which doesn't, by the way, mean that the other centers were clean either. It's merely that they weren't investigated as thoroughly. A high-level meeting was held at which the commissioner of the FDA was present, Frank Young, Vice President Saburo was welcome, a lot of big people. And they decided to use everything, to use complete garbage, to use fraudulent data, to cover it up, to let a report be published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which didn't give even the slightest hint that there were any problems whatsoever, let alone cheating, to sweep it under the rug. Well, this is fraud. People are afraid of the word, but I'm not. It's the only word that applies, and it's criminal fraud. And it's criminal fraud which has killed perhaps a couple 100,000 people, which means that it also qualifies as genocide. And under the recent Crime Act, genocide is one of those crimes which is punishable by death. So it's a very heavy thing. Now, what I think we should remember from this is if this type of fraud can be committed, including the collusion at the very highest level of the FDA, including the collusion deliberate of the New England Journal of Medicine, this means that we can't do what the so-called treatment activists do, you know, flip through the pages of the New England Journal, read the abstract and parrot the alleged findings. It means that we can't really trust anything in the New England Journal. We really have to use our own heads and our own common sense. That's a hard thing to do, but you know, that's the way it is. A fellow, Tim Hand, wrote a letter to the New York Times. It was printed, and he did an analysis of all of the ACT studies that had been printed. And he found that all of the studies which claimed to show benefits for ACT, and after the initial study, all of the benefits claimed were incredibly subtle. All of these studies were controlled completely by Boros Wellcome or one of the Wellcome companies, funded by them and controlled by them. On the other hand, there were a lot of studies that did not find benefits for ACT and found it was harmful. Without exception, all of these studies were not funded by Wellcome and were not controlled by Wellcome. And you know, I think one really has to think about this. We're now in the area of the protease inhibitor compounds, and my article, which is on your chairs, gives basically my thinking here. You know, I am certainly not an expert in the biochemical aspects, but I think one has to realize the hype that is taking place here. People always say, well, what about so-and-so? These Lazarus stories of people who were on their deathbed, and the next day they, you know, go to the gym again and start working and all of that. I think some of it might be psychological because For all of these years, there has been the sentence of doom for somebody who's HIV positive. They used the phrase AIDS is invariably fatal, even though there was never, ever any evidence that this was the case. Now, for the first time, people with an HIV positive diagnosis are being given hope. They're being given hope by the pharmaceutical industry, who said the hope is linked to taking one of these protease inhibitor compounds. Well, in fact, there is no rational way whatever that these compounds could be beneficial. All they can do is sicken people and eventually, or sooner, kill them. I think the other explanation is simply that it reflects a cynical selectivity in selecting the antidotes. Because certainly in Provincetown, a lot of people couldn't take them at all. They would take them a few days or a week or 2 weeks, and that was it. They just couldn't bear the side effects, and so they stopped. And these guys may be lucky. But they felt sorry for themselves. They had lost their hope, and instead of saying that the cocktail failed them, they said that they failed the drug, which is very sad. As far as the people who got sick and died, some of them from kidney failure, other things, these are never reported. Anecdotally they are. I mean, a lot of us know of such cases, and yet they are never portrayed in the media. So on treatment issues, I'll go into, I guess, try to what I think should be done, and this is a big question. Basically, there are two different areas. What should be done of people who have diagnoses, either of HIV positive or so-called AIDS, and then what should be done politically. I think with those who have diagnoses or who are friends or relatives of such people, the main thing is I think we've got to be tough. Really tough. This is not a message that everyone wants to hear, but there has been way too much sympathy and pity for people with diagnoses, and they have felt sorry for themselves too much. Well, of course they've gone through hell. I mean, nobody denies that there's been very real suffering there. On the other hand, some people are objectively healthy, and what they're really suffering from is a campaign of terrorism. Toughness means a lot of things here, but it would mean being able to see through all of the lies that have been told. It would mean being tough with doctors. A lot of people are so intimidated by their doctors they can't say no to them. I'm waiting for the day where one single person with AIDS will tell his doctor, "You're fired. You will not be paid for this visit. I want a refund of every penny I have paid you. Dr. So-and-so, you tried to make me take a protease inhibitor compound. You never told me that some of these things are carcinogens. You never told me AZT causes cancer in rodents, and that various diagnostic tests, in vitro tests, indicate that it must be a cancer, and that there's a strong correlation between long-term AZT use and cancer. How can you tell me I should take a cocktail with AZT without telling me it's a cancer? And what about the fraud? Everybody knows, or should know, that the trials were fraudulent. Tens of millions of people have seen a Meditel documentary, AZT Cause for Concern, where we showed, among other things, the cheating that took place in the trial. Why don't you know that? You're supposed to be the guy who knows all these things. Where do you get your information from? The Detail Man, which means salesman for pharmaceutical companies, the New England Journal of Medicine, and so on. This is a type of toughness. Why should we treat the doctors as though they were sort of holy men in this religion, which indeed it is in a way. I personally do not have an awful lot of respect for doctors. Studies of the American people show that doctors are absolutely at the pinnacle of prestige as far as occupations go. Doctors are undeniably rich. One can't deny that. You try to think what a poor doctor would be, and they're still pretty rich compared to everybody else. Doctors are very authoritarian people. They're also not terribly bright. For example, at Harvard, has tracked the IQs of people in the various schools for decades. The doctors at Harvard Medical School are probably about as bright as any doctors in the country. But their IQs are a good standard deviation, that'd be 15 IQ points, below the students in the college or the law school. Now that's not dumb, but on the other hand, it doesn't make them, omniscient, godlike figures either. And I would say that if somebody's supposed to be an expert in treating AIDS thing, that they damned well ought to know those things that I just said. If they want to tell people, okay, now let's go through the pros and cons of each of the drugs here, they would have to explain certainly that the nucleoside analogs were approved directly or indirectly on fraudulent research and that they cause cancer. The protease inhibitors, they'd have to go through a lot of hideous side effects and say, as far as whether or not they actually will help human beings, we don't know. There's no evidence that they will. And if they were really honest, they would have to say, you should know that every single drug in this cocktail is based on a false hypothesis that HIV causes illness. Another type of toughness, which we go into a little bit in the essays in the book, and this is really sensitive, deals with such things as benefits and disability. There are now people who have gone on disability who aren't even sick, because if they have a low enough T cell count and an HIV positive thing, they qualify for very good benefits, much better than the usual welfare benefits. I know people in New York City in a penthouse apartment with a doorman, free massages, free maid service, food stamps, rent, whole bit, and of course, free medical care. I myself have to pay $207 a month for rather lousy HMO medical care, and my taxes go to pay for all of these other things, so I may be slightly bitter. I can also say in Provincetown there are people who live in big, quite impressive houses. They also get the free massages and maid service and food stamps and all the rest of it. I think that it's a Faustian bargain. If these guys, follow through with it and take their cocktails the way they're supposed to, of course, they will get sick and they will die. On the other hand, if they're clever, they won't. It can ruin them. I can think of another couple I've talked to who have been ruined as human beings by being on disability so long. Both of these people are perfectly capable of working, and the point comes when they're virtually unemployable. Psychologically and otherwise, not only would they have no resume to offer, but the idea of going and putting in 7 hours hard work at a job and getting paid for it is something they just couldn't do anymore psychologically. They refer to themselves, the guy's 35 years old, you say, what do you do? They say, oh, I'm retired. Well, this makes me mad too. I mean, most people when they're retired, they have really worked to earn that status. I want to say, the hell you're retired. You are living basically on my tax money and those of other people who work for a living and have to wonder, can they send their kids to college and how they'll pay the rent and a lot of other things. So I think there may be a backlash which will have rather bad implications not only for people with AIDS, but in fact for gay men as a whole. What I think should be done in terms of just treatment, I don't consider myself at risk for so-called AIDS just because of my analysis of what makes people sick in those ways. Although actually I suppose any of us could become sick with one or more of the 30 things. I mean, there's so many ways of getting sick that none of us can be sure it couldn't happen. But say if I did have a diagnosis, what I would do would be to ruthlessly examine my own life to see if there were any health risks there and to deal with them. And I certainly would not take any AIDS drugs whatsoever. In fact, Michael Callan, in his study of long-term survivors, the one single most important thing of all was not taking AIDS drugs, or at least not taking so-called antivirals. Of the people Michael interviewed, I think there were 4 of them that were later persuaded to take AZT. Peer pressure. Dan Turner was one of these people. They had survived for years and fine without taking any of it, but their friends and doctors said, you've got to take AZT. And so they did, and they're all dead now. I think that part of recovery also is dealing with the psychological things. You know, Cass Mann makes a statement in his essay in the book that someone recovering from this diagnosis, which in a way is a type of a hex, a curse, that you have to separate from everything that's negative in your life. And what's negative in your life actually might be a friend or a relative or something like that. It could be a lot of things. But people have to be tough enough that whatever it is, they would move away from it, because after all, recovery should come first. I think the main thing of all, and this is something doctors don't like to hear at all, is that people have to think in terms of health, not in terms of fighting something, you know, some germ fighting the germ or whatever it is. It means thinking of living in a way that's just as healthy as possible. And that, you know, there's no one single thing you do to be healthy. You don't just swallow a pill and that makes you healthy. You've got to have good exercise, satisfying human relationships, good nutrition. You have to have, I think, some satisfying work and a lot of other things. Every single one of these things is involved in health. In terms of health, doctors, well, oh my goodness. Well. Well, I guess that's in control. I'm amazed by the hostility of physicians to the most elementary things of health. I've thought of a lot of slogans like the slogan, "Fighting for Our Lives." And I can remember the first time that appeared in the Christopher Street Gay Liberation March. And it was very moving, and we all thought, you know, here they are. You know, isn't it remarkable? They can even stand on their feet and march with a banner, because then most of them were close to death. Since then, I've really thought through the slogan, "Fighting for Our Lives," and I've come to regard it even with a certain amount of disgust. Because I think time and again, people who've had full-blown AIDS, who've been like really sick, but instead of getting their life in order, they continue to smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And some of them I've talked to. I've said, look, you know, you've had PCP, you have no business smoking. It's no fun, but you'll give it up. You just can't do this. And they make a joke out of it. I talked to one of the leading, and actually a man who was somewhat of a dissident, but a physician in New York, and said, look, I know some of your patients are smoking, you know, 3 or more packs of cigarettes a day. Can't you just tell them that if they're going to get better, they've got to stop it? And he looked at me and he rather sanctimoniously said, if you knew somebody had only a few months to live, would you really tell him to give up something that gives him pleasure? I just knew then that I really couldn't pursue the topic. I mean, I know as much about cigarettes as anybody. I can't imagine, you know, the whole room would be filled with a pile with those that I myself consumed. I don't know if I ever derived pleasure from them. You know, they were just something I had to have. I wouldn't call it pleasure. In terms of poppers, Cass Mann was visiting people in the hospital in London. And here he saw these people very, very sick. And on the table by their hospital bed were bottles of poppers. So he talked to the nurses and said, look, do you know this is probably the main candidate for causing KS? It's a powerful mutagen. It causes severe anemia. It could kill somebody with a stroke in a single episode. How can you let them do it? And the nurses said, well, we have been told by the doctors that we were not to interfere with the pleasures of the patients. And it even more, I'll give a couple more really disgusting things. The San Francisco AIDS Foundation has a colored poster which they have issued I forget the exact title, that deals with crystal. They realize that a lot of people there, including those who have AIDS, like to use crystal. So they tell them what to do. Make sure if you're going to use crystal that you have condoms with you. That was the first thing they thought of. Drink plenty of liquids. Then the question arises, well, and there were a lot of other things there. They went through a list of about 6 other drugs, and if you wanted to know about them, you would call them. So if you wanted to take ecstasy or who knows what, they could also give you advice on how you could safely use these drugs. In London, it's even worse there. A part of the insanity of the protease inhibitor compounds is that they have to be given on this incredibly intricate timetable, schedule. Some of the drugs have to be taken on a full stomach. Some of them have to be taken on an empty stomach. It's so elaborate that if the drug fails or kills the patient, almost in every case you say it's the fault of the patient. He just couldn't do what he was supposed to. But now suppose the patient, and of course there are potentially deadly side effects. They can react with a number of ordinary over-the-counter things and kill people. So that's another complication. But now suppose the person with AIDS taking this cocktail wants to go out to a rave party and have fun, take a little ecstasy and a few other things, or snort poppers. Well, how should he do it? So the gay doctors in London have risen to the challenge. They have prepared elaborate timetables showing how you can not only take all of the things in the protease inhibitor cocktails, but ecstasy and poppers and various other things as well. Well, okay, I guess the point of this is that we live in a profoundly sick culture, one which is hostile to health. AIDS can be incredibly complicated. You can get lost in all of the technobabble. If you get right down to it, it's really pretty simple. You just think health. And health means, not taking a protease inhibitor compound and so on and so forth. Not taking ecstasy, not smoking cigarettes and not snorting poppers and not living on nothing but candy bars. It's not so hard. To get down to the political question, which is important, sometimes I get discouraged because I have been a dissident now for well over a decade. In 1987, I was already thoroughly convinced and had written several articles that HIV didn't do anything. And I thought when Peter Duesberg published his first critique of it, I thought that's it. It's going to blow up. I don't know what type of damage control they'll try to do, but there's no way this craziness can last more than another 6 months. Well, now it's a decade later. There has been progress. The group for the scientific reappraisal of the HIV/AIDS hypothesis now has well over 500 members, and most of them are scientists and PhDs and various professionals. It's growing slowly. I think the growth of HEAL chapters is extremely inspiring. I think basically we just have to be in for the long haul. I don't know. It's really a lot of just what we do on a one-to-one basis. The books that I've published, like The AIDS War and Poison by Prescription, did well in a sense. Most books that are published are never reviewed at all, and most books that are published lose money. Mine were reviewed quite well, and they at least broke even or made some money. But so many doors were closed. So many of the usual places that would have reviewed it wouldn't. And there was a campaign of intimidation where so-called AIDS activists would go to bookstores and tell them to stop stocking my books and telling libraries to cancel order for them. A lot of this happened. But the one thing that helped with them was word of mouth. And no matter how much censorship there is and how much intimidation, so far they haven't discovered a way of stopping word of mouth. So I think we have to just try to get the word out. Eventually it will It will get through. The HIV thing, the whole paradigm, is so ridiculous, so monstrously absurd, that it simply can't go on forever. It may happen very slowly. It may take another 5 or 10 years until just gradually it will have moved away from it. No one will see any particular point. It might happen very quickly, and if some of the things that David Rasnick has said about the protease inhibitor compounds are true, all of a sudden there might be a horrible die-off of tens of thousands of people. This is very possible. In one mice study, the mice appeared to be completely normal up to the point that they all just started dying, 100% of them. I don't know if that will happen or not. Toxicology, it's very hard to say. I mean, it's unpredictable. It's amazing how much poison some people can tolerate with no apparent ill effects, and also other people, a very small amount of something can be fatal. So I don't really know that. But anyway, I think basically we have to get on with what you're doing at HEAL here. And for those of you who have been cursed by these particular diagnoses or someone else, there's real hope. And a real hope doesn't involve anything particularly arcane or anything particular unusual. It's just seeing things for the way they are, using common sense and taking appropriate action. There's no reason in the world why somebody who's had an AIDS diagnosis shouldn't be able to get better. People have been very, very sick at the edge of death and been restored to completely good and normal health. And as far as those who have merely an HIV positive diagnosis, this is bogus. It's nothing more than a type of a curse. And once you stand up to it and say this means nothing at all, there's no reason in the world to get sick. No reason in the world not to be every bit as healthy as the average person, and hopefully a great deal more so. Basically, I think that's all I want to say, and I'm sure I've left out a lot, and so we'll just pick it up in the discussion period.
Okay, word from our sponsor. This is the can that makes evenings like this possible. Please give us what you can so we can keep doing this. We are all volunteers. We are the only AIDS organization anywhere that runs strictly on love and very hard labor. So please give us, whatever you can so we can keep doing this every month and reach people with life-affirming, factual information that goes way the heck beyond hope. We are answering calls from all over the country every day, from people in prisons, from people that are hemophiliacs in the backwoods of Arkansas. And when you help us, you're helping them, and it all comes back to you. And then we take nothing off the top, we just use the funds to keep this thing going. So please give us what you can when the can comes in your direction. Mr. Arden, it's Derek. Also want to mention on the table back there, we have the documentary, the BBC documentary film that John mentioned by Meditel Productions, AZT Cause for Concern, and it's also on here with another BBC documentary, The AIDS Catch. These are two great documentary films that are back there and available to you. Got them all the way from London, just for you guys. We also have, for those of you who are new here this evening, all of our HEAL meetings are on videotape. These are 6-hour videotapes with all of the many guests we've had that put the pieces of this puzzle together. We've had Carrie Mullis, the inventor of the PCR. We've had Peter Duesberg. We've had Michael Elmer, who first founded the HEAL chapters in 1982. We've had just about everybody you can possibly think of that has anything to say about the factual aspects of HIV and AIDS on tapes at our meetings. And we have Sean Current, who was the editor of Provincetown Positive, who went from being a gay man and an AIDS activist to an HIV dissident. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Paul Philpott, the editor of Reappraising AIDS, just dicing and slicing that HIV hypothesis. Really great things are all back there in these tapes, so you can catch up with everything everybody else who's been coming here knows. And then I want to talk about my favorite book, the one I wrote. What If Everything You Thought You Knew About AIDS Was Wrong is back there in its second edition. This is the book that everybody that came here was asking about. Well, isn't there something simple we can have to share with other people that just breaks this down to a real, easy discussion, explains the science but doesn't get all scientific in terminology that's too hard to understand? This is it. It was done for you guys. It's back there and available. And once again, when you make this purchase, it goes right back into bringing all these things to you. So please, if you need any information, it's back there. Be generous. And now it's time for questions with John, and thank you very much. Do you want to moderate it, or you just want to feel?
Well, like I said, you want to call people? Right?
Okay, I'll call on people.
Yeah.
Greg, you had your hand up first.
Has this ever been, I've never heard this from Peter Duesberg, I've never heard this from anybody else, although it seems perfectly logical to me.
Okay, here you get outside my area of expertise. I mean, I try to be a good generalist. My own field is survey research in the social sciences. I couldn't really answer that. I will say that the debate on whether or not HIV has ever properly been isolated has been carried on mostly by Australian researchers and a German virologist, Stefan Lanke. They may possibly have reprints back there, or if you have access to the internet, there are now about 5 or 6 AIDS critical websites. And I think at least a couple of them have the major articles by the Australians and Stefan Lanke, who go into very great technical detail on how HIV has never properly been isolated. Next. Okay.
Are you familiar with the LA Men's study at UCLA? They have a very, very large ongoing, it's an epidemiological study. It's been going on for about 12 years. More than 1,000 gay men that have seroconverted during the time they've been in the study. And they claim that absolutely everyone that's seroconverted has their T cells have dropped within a year. Have you ever heard of this?
Okay, here's the situation now. Almost all epidemiology is a form of survey research. Clinical trials are all forms of survey research also. So basically this would be my home territory. I've criticized a few of the epidemiological studies, which are complete junk and garbage, because the people haven't the slightest idea what they're doing. A person in the Public Health Service who's friendly to me has sent me about a dozen questionnaires used in all the major studies, the MAC study, the San Francisco cohort, and so on. Only one of the questionnaires was professional, and it was a professional questionnaire that you might find from, say, about 1940 or so. Okay, I mean, it did the job, but all of the others were so grotesquely inadequate that I knew these people had no idea what they were doing. When I read the reports, they haven't the slightest idea how to write a methodology section. When they get into the report, they don't have the slightest idea how to make tables and comment on them. Most of these people are simply doctors or bureaucrats in the Public Health Service. They have never been trained in professional survey research, which is a very small, highly intellectual field. So in a nutshell, I don't try to analyze these things because I'm convinced that people haven't the slightest idea what they're doing, on top of which they are often dishonest. And in San Francisco, the study done by Warren Winkelstein and what's his name, Asher, trying to show that drugs had nothing to do with AIDS and HIV had everything to do with it. These guys had no training whatsoever in survey research, and I got that from them. I talked to them in San Francisco. I think they're both medical people, which means probably they wouldn't even have been bright enough to qualify as trainees in the field. But I know that's a non-answer. What I'm saying is that I satisfied myself that the type of so-called epidemiology that's done is rubbish and it doesn't deserve things. In some cases, you know, what you mentioned strikes me as utterly improbable. And so I would suspect also that it's probably phony on top of it. That's, okay, yeah.
This isn't my question, but I just want to... What you decided is how many of those 1,000 men started taking the drugs to that. My question, though, is about the drugs, the protease inhibitors. You said that what you think is that there's some psychological effect, that some of the improvement that's been seen in some individuals who are really sick is a psychological response. But I'm curious, HIV aside, is there any are these drugs in fact in any way really truly antiviral drugs? And if they are, could some of the improvement in some people who've been very sick be because they were suffering from conditions that were caused by viruses, and therefore these antiviral drugs may not be affecting HIV in their body, but these other viruses like CMV, and therefore causing improvement? Is there any...
Well, you have a right to speculate, maybe so. But actually you brought up a point that I omitted to give, which is that AZT and the nucleoside analogs are always described as reverse transcriptase inhibitors. And this is really grotesque because the actions of the drug are extremely simple from a biochemical standpoint. What AZT does is to terminate DNA synthesis, period. That's all it does and all it can do. Compared to AZT, aspirin is an incredibly complicated drug. Now, reverse transcriptase requires DNA synthesis, so therefore, if you were to stop DNA synthesis, you might inhibit a reverse transcriptase. But this would be like taking your backyard and setting off a napalm bomb. And then someone could observe that insects had been killed. And then you could market napalm bombs as insecticides. Yeah. It's, the DNA is the basis of life. And in fact, the original idea behind AZT was that cancer cells grow abnormally. And so therefore, by stopping DNA synthesis, it was hoped that it would kill cancer cells before it killed the patient. And then when you stop the AZT, and so on, yeah.
So none of these drugs are discriminate antiviral drugs?
Absolutely not.
None of them.
It was claimed originally that AZT had a selective preference for viral DNA as opposed to that of human cells. That research since was found to be false by at least half a dozen independent studies. They found that AZT is perhaps as much as 1,000 times more toxic to human cells than people believed at the time they approved AZT for research. And of course, the proof of the pudding, there are no hard actuarial survivals on AZT treatment. There should be. There should be a record of everybody put on it, what their diagnosis was, how many are alive a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later. This is information the AIDS industry does not want us to know. But there's no way that they can prevent us from having eyes to see. And as we all know very well, people on AZT have been dying like flies. A few people lived. It's true that a few people on low doses can survive for several years. But on the whole, most of them died a lot before that. Yes?
How come so many straight men in Thailand have died of so-called AIDS? Why do we hear about that?
Well, I don't know how many have. This gets into a whole other issue. Whenever the epidemiological contradictions of AIDS are brought up, and I didn't even begin to go into them, if an infectious microbe were causing it, why has it chosen, cultural parameters like gayness, to follow, and why are there 9 times as many men as women? Then they would always say, well, look at Africa. Africa, that's not true. And the response of Peter Duesberg and others is to say, well, okay. What this means is that whatever is happening in Africa has nothing to do with what's happening in the United States and Europe. They're totally different epidemics, if they are epidemics. Thailand, I don't know. Well, let me give you a bit of cutting-edge news here. This goes back 3 days. And it illustrates my idea that logic has fallen into a trance state. This was an OTC report, which is a business news service. And in the very first sentence, it told us that in Nigeria, There are now 5 million people infected with HIV, and the country has just reported its first AIDS case. Now, I don't know, you know, I don't know how many people have died in Thailand for whatever reasons that they called AIDS. I don't know how many people are HIV positive according to whatever test, and if they're positive, what caused it. I frankly don't know. All I know is that the whole thing falls into a pattern of just total craziness, at which the World Health Organization is by far the leader. One thing after another, the next explosion will be in this, that, or the other country, which now has, you know, 3 AIDS cases, and it never happens. Okay?
Isn't it true that AZT was developed as a...
No. It was developed as an attempt, as a failed cancer drug. When it was tested in mice, it had no effect whatever on their leukemia. And according to the early reports by the man who designed the drug, it not only failed to cure cancer, but actually caused it. That's what he told to a number of reporters, Jerome Horowitz. He later recanted and said, oh no, that wasn't true. He also said, oh, it wasn't true, it was rejected for toxicity. So apparently the AIDS industry got to Jerome Horowitz and told him, you know, to get his act together when he talked to interviewers. But no, it was developed as a cancer drug. The idea of when something which would kill growing cells would kill cancer cells because they grow very fast.
Any evidence of that methyl sulfoxide in the weapon?
No. There's a lot of disinformation. There's disinformation that the AIDS virus was created as a form of biochemical warfare, which is all nonsense, because if the KGB or the CIA or the Third or Fourth Reich or whatever did it, they created a dud. Oh, yes. Okay.
You were saying that the people you know who take an AZT have died in a year or two. I've been just getting educated, and I've talked to a lot of different organizations across the country, like Project Inform, ACTLA, Institute of National Health, etc. And they said they know people who have been taking AZT since it first became available in 1987, and many of them are still alive. And how do you explain the tests going on at Dr. Ho's office and other places where they're taking AZT, 3TC, and Crixaban for 18 to 24 months? Every one of them shows undetectable traces of HIV. It seems to be helping, not hurting.
Well, there are a number of things here. There's a lot of disinformation. A lot of people claim to have been on AZT, some of them since 1985 or 6, which is an absolute impossibility. Every single one of the people in the phase 1 trials in 85 are dead. Every single one of the people that were in the phase 2 trials is dead. And this is known, and even Wellcome admits to this. I am highly skeptical of this sort of thing. We have to realize that this is a situation where billions of dollars are at stake and where propaganda, meaning deliberate lying, takes place. As far as David Ho goes, I wouldn't believe if the man said the sun was shining, I wouldn't believe him. I'm sorry.
Why? I mean, I just don't understand why, because I thought his research was being validated by studies going on across clinical trials, not only in the United States, but the entire world. And it's hard for someone new to try and understand when you see so many viewpoints, and there's a lot of people who have some good credentials like you do, who are giving a totally different view. How am I to know what's right?
Well, it's not easy. You have to think for yourself. But if you ask why would someone lie, why would David Ho say something that's not true? Why would other people, why would Margaret Fischel or Paul Fulberding or Fauci? It's because when you have an immense amount of money that a lot of people get it in stock options, honoraria, under the table. Certainly the AIDS activists very obviously have benefited from this. I don't believe any of this nonsense about these miraculous results with these cocktails. The people I know in Provincetown, there are a lot of them. Any of the success stories have now turned into failure stories, and the people are going through horrible side effects. Some of them have their belly sticking out like this, or their faces all swollen up, Or they will come into a meeting and say, I saw my doctor today and I got good news and bad news. And they said, my viral load is down to almost nothing, but my kidneys are shot, and so my doctor says I'll have to go on different medicines. Okay, the viral load I thought I went into. If you want to, there's an article called Viral Load of Crap from Reappraising, which analyzes it technically. No way in the world does a viral load test actually count real infectious viruses, which is what people think. It merely makes crazy projections based on an identification of genetic sequences which might or might not have something to do with HIV, which might or might not exist. It's all total craziness. And if you want to read the responses to the whole way papers that started the whole thing, you'll find them in Nature magazine following the initial reports. I don't know the exact date. Oh, okay.
I've had experience. I've lost 2 sons. One of them took AZT very aggressively. And I don't know, I would agree with you that perhaps his aggressive use of AZT accelerated his death. The other one was holistic in his approach. And for years did nothing except all the things that you are recommending. He finally took some AZT along with other drugs when he got dementia. He took it for a short period of time, he came out of dementia and stopped. He did almost all the things that you were recommending, and he died.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that, but we don't fully understand everything about health and sickness.
His attitude was extremely positive.
Well, I really couldn't say. I mean, whether there were psychological things here, whether there might be some health risk that might even be unknown. It's hard to say. I want to emphasize I'm not a doctor, and so any opinion I gave really would be unjustified. Oh, yes.
What would be your opinion of the contributing cause to the group of illnesses that were discovered early on before AZT was available? What do you think caused those illnesses and they became the same as AIDS, particularly the high incidence of PCP in a population that before that had no incidence of it, the high incidence of KS in a population that before that had no incidence?
Okay, I have gone into great detail in the questions of why gay men and why IV drug users became sick in ways that were called AIDS. My latest book, The AIDS Cult, probably has the most concise thing. To give a brief summary, I think intravenous drug users became sick really because of the drugs they took, because the illnesses, pneumonia, were the classic illnesses of IV drug users. With gay men, I think it was a mix of things. I think recreational drugs were the main cause, but I think there were also very powerful psychological issues. As far as what causes Kaposi sarcoma, this is still a mystery. But Gallo and the top people now think there may be as many as 4 different types of KS. They themselves admit that the Popper's hypothesis, the nitrite inhalants hypothesis, is about as good as any. And in some ways, Popper's very, very closely fit the data here. Almost nobody except gay men did use Poppers, and of those who developed KS, as far as we know, it could very well be 100% of them used Poppers. Also, Poppers fit in with the clinical picture because Poppers very much dilate the blood vessels, and KS is an abnormality of that. Poppers are powerfully mutagenic, and that would also fit in. So if you were trying to think of something that would be a likely cause of KS, probably the nitrite inhalants are about as close as anything you could. But it's a mystery. I mean, I wouldn't claim to know all of the possible things that caused illness. Yes?
There's so many things that where I really think you're right on track about. But that issue of the drug abuse is definitely your weakest link from my viewpoint. I
I guess if I was to formulate a question, is how do you separate your vision of this corollary drug abuse evidence? How is that different from how you criticized the other side for correlated evidence before? And it sounds very correlated to me, as opposed to any, I mean, I don't hear that you document this.
Okay, the difference would be, first of all, that in order to falsify one hypothesis, the HIV thing, you don't necessarily have to come up with an alternative. Although if you do, if you have a compelling alternative hypothesis, this is one of the most powerful ways of falsifying another one. But since I have basically deconstructed so-called AIDS, there are so many different ways of becoming sick that qualify for it. This means that there could be many different causes of the AIDS illnesses. Now, I have, it's true, looked very closely at drug abuse, and at least the early cases. I've never forgotten a couple of doctors in New York where they were discussing their AIDS patients, and almost by accident they realized that every single one of their AIDS patients, not a single exception, that they were all alcoholics. Well, this is something that you just simply don't find in the official AIDS literature. They all
Early in San Francisco, when anecdotal evidence was all we had. We had to give that up. I mean, it just didn't work.
Okay, here's what epidemiology or survey research done on this has never been really studied. The first 50 gay men with AIDS, and they came to absolutely bizarre conclusions. After seeing that 100 heavy drug abusers, they found that the control group also were incredibly heavy drug abusers. They said, oh well, there's no difference. So they eliminated that, and they concluded that the only risk that they could identify for AIDS was having a very large number of sexual partners, and for a long time the CDC, as their only risk reduction guideline, told gay men that they should reduce their number of sexual partners. Well, this is just total craziness, and if I were doing it as a professional, I would get a large random sample of gay men with AIDS diagnoses, and I would find out everything about them. I wouldn't worry about a control group. This is what you call a monadic study, where you look at one thing at a time. There are times when you do need a control group, but there are times when you don't. In this case, if you were to find out, that certain characteristics were found in these guys, in virtually all of them, which clearly were not present in the general population, then you could make a very strong hypothesis. If you find that, say, 100% of gay men with Kaposi sarcoma used poppers heavily, whereas ordinary people in the general population, this is really something to think about. Let's see, who hasn't? Yes.
I'm a pharmacist. I'm here so I can feel a place, but I agree with everything you're saying. I think one of the things that people are unaware of, a lot of people, is drugs and sort of thing. AZT is not the first one. When I came out of school in 1969, we were dispensing enteral bioform from the drugstore. About mid-1970s, it just sort of disappeared. We couldn't get it any longer. And I didn't hear, none of us heard anything that happened to it until a few years ago. I got some information from PETA, and that's when I discovered that the Japanese government had sued Ciba-Geigy for blinding 70,000 Japanese people over a 30-year period. And when they forced Geigy to produce all the information on iodohydroxyquin from its original studies, they discovered that it had killed every laboratory animal that they gave it to, that it actually caused the diarrhea that they said it was supposed to cure, but it's still on the market today. You can get it in Mexico, and as a matter of fact, it was recently approved once again for sale to people with AIDS in the United States. Now, this is the kind of morality that is there in the pharmaceutical business. I don't have much, I don't have a lot of faith in the ethics of these people. I've seen other drugs on the market just since I've been out. Oroflex is another one, released by Eli Lilly about 10, 15 years ago. I forget how long it was. They knew it was killing people in Europe at the time that they were pushing for release of it here. It killed 50 Americans in 3 months in the United States. They were fined $26,000 by the FDA, I think it was, and that's all that happened to them. So as far as what you're saying about AZT and the fraud that's behind that, it's not surprising at all to me. The other thing that I think that people are unaware of is that in this country, everybody talks about the doctors and they talk about the drug companies, but in between is the pharmacist. Now the pharmacist is billed as the drug expert. Now that may be a throwaway term, but the reality is the doctor's not trained in drugs. The doctors don't know pharmacology many times. They don't know what these drugs are going to do. It's the pharmacist that knows. It's the pharmacist who has very little say in what's going on. And many of them are just lockstepping their way through their career so they can get out the other side and go to Florida or wherever. So there's a lot of things. One more thing, I don't mean to be monopolizing the time. This gentleman here asked about if they ever isolated the antigen. Dr. Gallo was the man who defined the antigen. He could define anything he wanted as the antigen. Right? So just remember that whatever this man said is the antigen to HIV. He defined it that way. Who knows what that may be?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I think I would be more inclined to trust pharmacists and doctors. The drug clyoquinol is treated briefly in Peter Duisberg's book, Inventing the AIDS Virus, and also in an appendix in my book, The AIDS War. And that was largely through the efforts of Meditel Productions that made the AIDS critical documentaries from England that exposed the role of that. But I myself have taken a close relative of the drug, along with Humatin, as one of the cocktails that we were given for amoeba. And that failed, and so I was given Flagyl, and at least the doctor said, you should know this is a carcinogen, among other things, and I took it and it worked, but it was pretty awful. Yes?
So I just want to say I'm now practicing Oriental medicine. I work at Perth, and I work at
Yes?
Have you done any research into hydrazine sulfate, and is that still a strong contender in alternative medicine, alternative healing drugs?
No, I have not. I try to follow some of the alternative things. My own outlook is so different. I mean, I think once we've deconstructed AIDS, and I think once somebody, has made the appropriate steps to live in a more healthful way, I don't see remedies, either alternative or conventional, that are designed to, attack something.
But in Russia, they were using it, and they were killing many thousands of people when they walked in the door. It was not even a black and white situation. They were being healed, and they're wondering why the hell America wouldn't do something about it.
Well, yeah.
They're being sponsored by the cancer groups out there. They're being sponsored by the cancer groups in America.
Yeah.
So sure, what's the
Oh, I see. Right, so the answer is I don't know.
Do you have anything on the benzene hypothesis?
On what?
Benzene hypothesis of AIDS for KSM?
I know enough to think I don't think there's anything to it. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, is there any, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about the psychological aspects of AIDS, and I would like to know, is there any literature or anyone that we can hear that will go into that, because I think this answers the question about how some people take holistic things and some people take the regular drugs, and they have such internalized homophobia, we cannot admit to ourselves, and I know because I'm a priest, and I know that there's such internalized homophobia prejudices that we have against ourselves, and we don't even admit to ourselves that has an effect. That if you have a room of 50 people that have been told by religion and by society and by psychologists for years that you are disordered and you are sick, and you love these people that tell you these things, when someone says you have a disease inside, you're going to say, this is just, I need to die. Is there any book or anything that goes into this psychological aspect of internalized that's killing ourselves? Because I think the greatest oppressors of gay men have been gay men.
Well, Well, basically, you're asking me to give a plug for my own book, which it's probably sold out. I only had a few copies left, called the AIDS Cult. Right, okay. Now, it will be available here in Los Angeles at a Different Light bookstore in West Hollywood. Any bookstore could order it. You just have to remember my name and the title. But I prefer to support my local bookstore, so if you could get it through them, that would be best. Yeah, it's 8 different people, and the viewpoints are not the same, but it goes into many of the psychological things that are making gay men sick. Oh, yeah.
We have a few more minutes for questions, but I just wanted to let people here know there's a HEAL chapter that would like to form in Orange County. So if anyone here has friends in Orange County, people you know down there that would like to participate in a HEAL group, there's a woman here this evening that plans on starting that, and she's right back there. If you could raise your hand, Linda. Just speak with Linda. She'd like to get you. Thank you, and then we have time for a few more questions.
Well, let's see. Okay.
So the picture you mentioned of the kind of Scientific American, and also one, I think it was David Ho when he won Man of the Year from Time. Is that just something they cooked up that looked nice? So they claim that this is HIV on a T cell or something.
Well, it's true, the mind does sort of boggle. I mean, when you think of the entire American Public Health Service, virtually all of the media, you know, with a few exceptions, most of the medical journals, it just seems overwhelming. But all I can suggest is, you know, if you want to go into these things intellectually, start digging and see what Duisberg and other people have said on it. These things fall apart as soon as you start being skeptical of them. The alternative, I mean, for people faced with the immediate decisions, is just to, on whatever grounds, make it, you know, a gut reaction and just reject all of this and walking away from the whole AIDS sphere and getting better, which I think there's a lot to be said for that.
I think how about if we end the formal part of the meeting and then you can just hang around and ask John your questions, and thank you all very much for coming this evening. Bye-bye.
We'll just keep it informal. That's great.
Yeah.
there.